Let's start with Moses. 120 years old, sight still intact, clear as a whistle, and still as strong as an ox. His vigor, his strength, the text tells us, had not run away. That's the literal translation. Now, I don't know about you, I'm 57 years old, and sometimes it feels like my vigor has been backing slowly out of the room in the hope that I wouldn't notice. Moses is clearly a pretty important and significant figure. We could talk a lot about the way in which this text from Deuteronomy brings the story of Moses, and indeed the life of Moses, to a close, forever making it tricky for those who want to insist that Moses wrote the book of Deuteronomy. It's pretty difficult to work out how you write the story of your own death. But what a life! The person who saw God face to face, the one who led God's people from slavery to freedom, the one who went up the mountain and came down with the greatest gift of all, the law. 2 tablets. In his left, the tablet that told the people of God about their duties and their obligations towards God. In the right, the tablet that told the people of God about their duties and their obligations towards each other. Moses, the lawgiver, who pointed the people of Israel to those 2 relationships that make sense of what it means to be the people of God. Vertically, a relationship with the God who called them, who chose them, who loved them, who delivered them from Egypt. And horizontally, in their relationship to each other. He died, the text tells us. Those clear eyes were able to see the land that God had promised, but were never able to walk in that land, and those eyes closed. And then Moses is summarily dismissed. 30 days of mourning, and they don't even know where they buried him. Next chapter, Joshua, conquest, with all of the complexity and the conflicts that that story entails. But then did you notice how whoever wrote Deuteronomy, not Moses, how they don't stop there with Moses dead and Joshua about to take over? As with all good eulogies, there's an attempt to say not just what happened, but to try and account for who this person was. It's not enough to say that Moses was a great man who died. He becomes Israel's primary and founding prophet. And forever after, from Joshua through to Jesus and beyond, when God's people meet someone who speaks God's word, who calls them back to their relationship with God and to each other, they would compare that person to Moses. You can't understand the story of Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew without the story of Moses. Jesus, the one whom a fearful king seeks to assassinate at his birth. Sound familiar? Jesus, the one who crosses the sea and feeds the multitudes in the wilderness. Heard that story before? Jesus, the one who goes up mountains again and again, whose face shines on the mountain of transfiguration, who teaches the law on the mountain of the sermon on the mountain. You have heard that Moses said, but now I say to you. So let's move from Moses to Jesus. Now, I'm a visitor here, so picking up points of cultural reference might be a bit tricky because I don't know you well. I wonder if you've ever been to a fairground or to an amusement arcade and come across a fairground or an amusement arcade game called Whack-A-Mole. It's basically one of those arcade games that lets you work out your frustration for your boss, your partner, your children, whoever, by committing acts of imaginary violence on poor defenseless animals. You're given a soft hammer or a mallet, and before you there are 8 holes, out of which, one of which will pop the head of a cute little mole. I went off and did some research about whether there are moles in Australia. That's a whole rabbit warren you don't want to, or maybe a mole's tunnel that you don't want to get down. There are moles in Australia, but they're also marsupials. How weird is that? So your job on this game is when the mole pops up its head to whack it with the mallet. But as soon as you do so, another one pops up and another hole. Over and over and over again. It doesn't matter how hard you hit, how effectively you deal with one little critter, another one pops up there ready for the hammer to strike it on the head. In the section of Matthew's Gospel that we've been reading, bear with me, over recent weeks, Jesus is playing whack-a-mole with the Jewish authorities. They keep popping up, and he keeps hitting them over the head, but they refuse to go away. In Matthew 21:23, chief priests and elders show up, and they say to him, "By what authority are you doing these things?" And Jesus answers their question with another question, to which they don't know the answer, which leads Jesus to refuse to answer their question. Whack. In 22:15, the Pharisees have a go. Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar? Have a look at the coin, says Jesus. Whose head is there? It's Caesar's head. Well, give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar. Whack. The text tells us they were amazed and they just left him alone. In 22:23, it's the Sadducees' turn. They stick their heads up to ask a very tortuous question that the lectionary leaves out for fear that it would complicate things too much for preachers and for congregations. The question is about marriage laws and the resurrection. And Jesus simply says, there isn't any marriage at the resurrection. Whack. And in the passage we read this morning, we meet the final mole. A lawyer who Matthew associates with the Pharisees. I imagine one of those scenarios in which the Pharisees who were gathered there in the temple kind of all push him forward. You have a go. Or all take one big step back, leaving him fully exposed. A final question, a final test for Jesus. And let's be clear, this is a fair test. It's a fair question. He's not so much as an opponent of Jesus, as a dialogue partner, a genuine, in good faith interlocutor. To expect Jesus, who is teaching in the temple, to be able to do what so many other Jewish teachers would do, namely to summarize the Jewish law, that's a perfectly reasonable explanation. What is the greatest commandment? He asks. And Jesus answers in a way that would let her leave all the moles, all the Jewish leaders, the elders, the chief priests, the Sadducees, the Pharisees, the lawyers, all there simply nodding their head in agreement. You see, those 2 tablets that Moses brought down from the mountain were already some kind of summary of God's will, one related to God and the other to people. And what Jesus offers is a summary of the summary. You're to love God, Deuteronomy 6 verse 4, taken from the prayer that every Jew would say every day, that Jesus himself would pray every day 3 times. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your mind and strength and soul. And love your neighbor. Leviticus 19:18, a text that others have spotted, was a good summary of the law in relation to our ethical obligations to other people. Do you see the pattern? Love God, love neighbor. Jesus says it, everyone agrees, the game is over, no more whacks are needed, everyone is on the same page. Which, let's face it, is the page that lots of people want to be on. What they want for their faith, for their religion, for their church, is to be about love of God and love of one's neighbour. Spirituality on the one hand, ethics on the other. Piety and kindness. Or if you want it in Latin, the choir sang it to you earlier. Ubi caritas et amor. Where there is love and kindness, there God is. In the church's mission to the world, we often think of ourselves as holding 2 tablets, pointing people to a God who loves them, and to those in our world who are in need of love and care and compassion. To focus on these 2 things, to be people of spirituality and ethics, to be people of prayer and justice. This is what it means to follow in the way of Jesus, isn't it? For his words and his actions to inform our living. But there are 2 problems with being on that page. The first is that religion, love God, love neighbour, which absolutely was the religion of Moses and the religion of Jesus, well, as I found myself saying to many people recently, if you really want to follow that religious tradition taught by Jesus of Nazareth, there's a synagogue down the road that would be more than happy to welcome you. There's nothing Christian about it. It's the religion of Judaism. It's Jesus' own religion. But secondly, Jesus hasn't put his hammer down yet. And the final whack of this section of Matthew's Gospel is not his answer to a question, but is the question that he asks to which they have no answers. What do you think of the Messiah? Let's be clear, when Matthew attaches verses 41 to 46, called in our Bible something like the question about David's son, to this section about Jesus summarizing the law, Matthew is making a point. And the point is one that marks out, of course, the distinctiveness of what became early Christian beliefs about Jesus, namely that he was not simply a teacher of the law, a prophet in the line of Moses, but something else, something greater, something deeper, to the point when you read about his life, you should be constantly asking yourself the question, who is this? It's that question that Jesus himself asks the Pharisees to answer. And it's a tricky piece of argumentation, intended by Matthew to remind us, to remind the reader that under the surface of the story that Matthew is telling, under the surface of the life of Jesus, his deeds of compassion, his teaching of the law, something else is going on. Is the Messiah the son of David? Yes, of course he is. But if that's the case, why in Psalm 110 does David refer to 2 people called Lord? The Lord said to my Lord. Well, one of them we know is God. But who's the other? The implied answer, not spelt out by Matthew, but there for the reader of Matthew's gospel to intuit for themselves under the surface, is that the other Lord is the Messiah. And the further implication is that if the Messiah is Lord, then the Messiah cannot simply be the Son of David. The Messiah is the Son of God. Psalm 110 is the most important and oft-cited Old Testament text in the development of early Christian beliefs about Jesus. For those first Christians, when they tried to make sense not only of what Jesus did and said, but of what had happened to him and of what God was doing in raising Jesus from the dead, this text spoke to them of someone who, yes, was descended in the line of David, but who more importantly shared God's name, the name of Lord, and shared God's authority by sitting at God's right hand. This is God's Son, a phrase and an idea that after the events of Easter came to define the movement that grows out of the movement that Jesus started. The question that came into sharp and urgent focus after Easter Sunday is a question that people were already asking as they encountered Jesus. Who is this? Or rather, it's a question that they experienced Jesus constantly asking of them. Who do you think I am? In a best-forgotten film called Beaches, the American actress Bette Midler has the immortal line delivered after she had spent a few minutes talking to someone about herself. You may know people like that. That's enough about me, she says. What about you? What do you think of me? What do you think of me? I want to suggest this morning that there is no conversation with Jesus about the way to life or about the way that about the way to God that does not end up with us being asked the question by Jesus, what do you think of me? And there is no kind of Christian discipleship or life together in the community of the church that doesn't keep that question and the answers that Jesus and Jesus' followers gave to it at the center of our life, our worship and our witness and our service. There is no kind of presence of the church in our world or in our communities, no kind of mission worth its name that doesn't insist that we are here not only to answer people's questions about how to live, how to be good or kind or just, or how to connect with God, but for us to ask again and again the question that people find very difficult to answer. In the words of the theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who is Jesus Christ for us today? In the technical terms of a theological college, there is no ethics without Christology. There is no spirituality without Christology. By the end of the Gospel of Matthew, the disciple community will be sent into the world to teach and to baptize and to make disciples, but the only basis on which it is possible is the recognition that the one who is again finally up the mountain is the one to whom all authority in heaven and on earth has been given. Jesus is Lord. This is the confession of our baptism. Jesus is Lord. This is the faith of the church. Jesus is Lord. This is the hope for the world. Jesus is Lord. That is the answer that keeps the question ever before us today and tomorrow. What do you think of Jesus? Amen.